And then I'll go ahead and introduce our great panel. So on behalf of the TCU Asian Studies program, welcome to our panel on the 2021 Japanese election. I'm Michael Strauss, the Director of Asian Studies for a little while longer, and also an associate professor of political science at TCU. So each of our three speakers will speak for about 12 minutes. And then at that point, we'll be able to do a Q&A. I imagine we'll go for about an hour, maybe a little longer. If you have questions while they're presenting, you can go ahead and type them into the chat window, and I can read them to the speakers after the talks. But also, feel free to wait, save your question for the end, and raise your hand and ask it then. So I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers in the order they'll be presenting, and then I will let them take over. So our first speaker, Daniel M. Smith, is the Gerald L. Curtis Visiting Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University. His research focuses on political parties, elections, and legislative politics in contemporary Japan and Western Europe. Our second speaker will be David Leheny, who is a professor in the Graduate School of Asian Pacific Studies at Waseda University. He's the author of 3 books, most recently, Empire of Hope, The Sentimental Politics of Japanese Decline. And our third speaker will be Yeon Ju Lee, who's an assistant professor also at Waseda Institute for Advanced Study at Waseda University. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School. Her dissertation, Democracy Without Redistribution, The Sense of Injustice, Perceived Inequality, and Preferences for Redistribution in East Asia, is the first non-economics dissertation to win the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Working Group Dissertation Prize, awarded by Nobel laureate James Heckman's Center for Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. So please, Dr. Smith, go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so you can share yours.
Okay, I think everybody should be able to see my screen with the slides. Thank you, Mike, for the kind invitation to come speak this evening with 2 of my favorite people, Yeon Ju Lee and Dave Leheny, as co-panelists. This roundtable is about the recent election that happened on Halloween in 2021. And together with Robert Pekkanen at University of Washington and Steve Reed at Chuo University, I have the honor of editing a volume on the election that'll be coming out from Paul Grave Macmillan that includes a really terrific group of contributors and covers everything from the various parties that contested the election to aspects of the campaign and analyzing the results, and then numerous policy issues ranging from the coronavirus pandemic to Black Lives Matter in Japan, to monetary policy, to foreign policy, and as Yeon Ju and David will be talking about this evening, inequality and also the Olympics. Our subtitle of the coronavirus election isn't yet set in stone. We have some time to decide that, and we're currently playing around with the title. But maybe if we wanted to sell more books, we would give the volume a title like Senkyo, the Japanese Art of Electing Politicians, which seems to be the formula for attracting or writing books on Japan these days. Senkyo meaning election in Japanese. Some basics on the elections, just to kind of set the stage, since I guess I will talk about the basic outcome of the election and some of the policy issues that were at play, and then Yeon Ju will talk about inequality, and Dave will talk about the Olympics. The election in 2021 comes after it's the first election not headed by Prime Minister Abe Shinzo since the 2012 election. Abe was Prime Minister for 8 years, offering stable leadership for Japan and leading the LDP in several dominant or landslide elections. He was replaced by his Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga Yoshihide in 2020. Suga Yoshihide had to call an election by October 2021 because the last election held under Abe was in 2017. There's 4-year terms for the House of Representatives. Suga's popularity sunk over time. He struggled to deal with several policy challenges, including the pandemic, including handling the delayed Tokyo Olympics, which were supposed to take place in summer of 2020, but were of course delayed to summer of 2021, and rising inequality, which we'll hear about later in the roundtable. He saw the writing on the wall in summer of 2021, stepped aside, announced he wasn't going to run for another term as party president, and he was replaced by Kishida Fumio in September 29 election for the LDP party president. Kishida formed his cabinet and then dissolved the House for elections that took place, as I mentioned, on October 31st, Halloween. His new cabinet signaled a shift from the Abe Suga years. 65% of his appointees to cabinet were new to cabinet, many of them not from the Abe-led Hosoda faction. And he pledged the policies which he dubbed New Capitalism, which were intended to signal a shift from the Abe years of Abenomics. Here's a timeline of the election events. So September 29th, Kishida wins the LDP presidential contest and officially becomes prime minister October 4th, dissolves the House of Representatives on October 14th. The campaign begins shortly afterwards. Halfway through the campaign, there were 2 House of Councilors special elections held, and they were sort of like bellwethers, and the LDP did poorly in those, relatively poorly given expectations. As a result, it was a surprise when on October 31st, the LDP ended up winning, doing much better in the election than anticipated by public opinion polling. A little bit of background on the electoral system and the party system. Since 1994, Japan's House of Representatives is elected with a mixed member majoritarian system where voters get 2 votes, cast 1 vote for a candidate in the first past the post single member district plurality rule contest. There's 289 of those seats. And then 1 vote goes to a party in a regional, one of 11 regional districts that elects 176 seats total through proportional representation. Candidates are permitted to run in both tiers, and if a candidate loses in the single member district contest but is elected, they can still be elected to the PR tier if their position on the party list is high enough, given sometimes various formulas that parties use. Another aspect of the context of the election is persistent LDP dominance. The LDP, since it was founded in 1955, dominated elections and controlled government until 1993. It was briefly out of office for 10 months from 1993 to 1994. And during that time, this electoral system reform was passed. And the new electoral system that's currently in place was intended to encourage 2-party competition and alternation in power through the single member districts being dominant in the system. But in practice, apart from 3 years from 2009 to 2012, the LDP has continued to dominate elections, thanks in part to its coalition arrangement with Komeito, a small religious party that trades votes for participation in the coalition, telling its supporters to vote for LDP in most of the single member districts, and a fragmented opposition. So multiple opposition parties are running, they split the anti-LDP vote in many districts, and the LDP is able to win with a plurality rather than a majority of votes. In 2021, it looked like things were going to be somewhat better for the opposition because in anticipation of the House being dissolved, 4 of the progressive or leftist opposition parties, led by the Constitutional Democratic Party or CDP, and with the Japanese Communist Party, Social Democratic Party, and a new party, the Reiwa Shinsengumi, coordinated candidacies in 217 of 289 single member districts. So they didn't run against each other. They tried to avoid splitting the progressive vote. And they downplayed their policy disagreements in the campaign. The JCP, which is unpopular with many voters, pledged not to participate in government if the CDP were to win. They would simply support the CDP government from outside of government. Other opposition parties, the more centrist and center-right parties of Ishin and the Democratic Party for the People, chose not to join in this cooperation, although did not always run candidates against the opposition parties. Ishin and Komeito, in addition, did not challenge each other in several races in the Kinki area in Osaka and Hyogo prefectures. But all of this coordination wasn't enough. Despite the unpopularity of the LDP's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, and Kishida's initial popularity being under 50% support when his cabinet was formed, and all of the opposition parties on the left trying to coordinate candidacies, the LDP still managed to win with their coalition partner a comfortable majority of seats, 293 in the House of Representatives, 63% of the total seats. They lost only 15 seats. Most of those were in single member district contests where the coordination did work. But unfortunately, the CDP and other opposition parties did worse in the proportional representation tier. The only party that really did well was the Ishin party, which picked up a ton of seats in Osaka and the rest of the Kinki region of Japan, where they're strongest. And it's become the third largest party in the Diet. So apart from these headline results, an additional puzzle that I've been working on is why the LDP continues to win elections, and whether this is because it's simply more popular. Does it run on policies that voters support or not? The policies that were salient in the 2021 election were multiple, but there were 5 big issues that were discussed by all of the parties. Of course, the coronavirus policy was a major issue, but there was lots of agreement, general agreement on what the policy should be. One outlier was that the CDP called for continued and enhanced quarantine policy. In terms of economic policy, most of the parties promised new social benefits to deal with the economic effects of the coronavirus, but the opposition parties wanted to repeal or reduce the consumption tax, which had been increased under the Abe administration. In terms of national security, the LDP notably proposed increasing defense spending to up to 2% of GDP, and all except the JCP supported the US-Japan Security Alliance. Nuclear energy since the March 11th, 2011 meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi has been a salient issue in Japanese politics as well. Most parties want Japan to move towards more renewable energy. The LDP is the only party that supports restarting all nuclear power plants. The JCP is adamant about wanting zero nuclear power. And in one particularly interesting aspect of the 2021 campaign is that there was much more discussion of social diversity and social issues. So most of the parties in Japan have now support promoting a greater understanding of LGBT citizens and gender identity issues. And all except for the LDP support the ability for married couples to elect to keep their separate surnames. Some parties even have supported same-sex marriage. These are the parties' manifestos, policy manifestos, the parties released during the campaign for their issues. And during this campaign, together with Yusaku Horiuchi from Dartmouth and Shisei Eshima from Harvard, and we were later joined by Shiro Kuriwaki from Stanford, we ran a survey experiment to look at whether voters actually support the policies of the LDP or the other parties' policies in the election. So we ran this survey during the election campaign. We had over 3,000 eligible voters in our sample. It was roughly representative of the population, though it's not a random sampling. And then we have various other questions and quality control checks in the survey. The basic idea is that we showed voters a table like this, where there's party 1 and party 2. They're hypothetical parties, they're not real parties. And each party has a profile of policy positions on the 5 major issues: nuclear energy, national security, social diversity, coronavirus policy, and economic policy. And these were randomized, but the policy positions were taken directly from the parties' actual policy manifestos in the campaign. And we asked respondents to choose which party they would most support. Because we fully randomized this, then we can estimate which policy positions made it more likely that a particular bundle would be chosen over another policy bundle. And we can compare these to the actual policies of the parties that ran. This is not all that unusual to see these kinds of tables in newspaper coverage of elections. So this is an example from Yomiuri Shimbun before the election. And you can see that the table is very similar to the kinds of tables that we're showing respondents in this survey. here are the LDP's policies. So in terms of coronavirus policy, the LDP advocated disseminating oral medicine and some other things. Economic policy, primarily giving financial support to non-regular workers, women, households with children, and students, and so on. National security, strengthening the US-Japan alliance, as I mentioned, increasing defense spending to 2% GDP. On nuclear energy, restarting nuclear power plants. On a social diversity, the LDP, as I mentioned, was the only party to not take a position on separate surnames or same-sex marriage. All the other parties supported those policies. This is what the respondents told us about the popularity of different policies. So estimates, points, these are called average marginal component effects. And if the point is to the left of the zero line, it means that the LDP's policy was more popular than that party's policy on the policy issue. If the point is to the right of the line, it means that the LDP's policy was less popular. So the opposition parties or the Komeito were proposing a policy that was more popular. So for an example, the policy proposed by the CDP of requiring people to quarantine in hotels for at least 10 days was less popular, and the least popular policy in terms of COVID, less popular than the LDP's. If we look at the other policy areas, all of the parties that proposed allowing married couples to keep separate surnames are more popular than the LDP's position. In terms of economic policy, the Komeito's policy of providing 100,000 yen to children up until high school age was very unpopular, and the policies for lowering the consumption tax were very popular. Abolishing nuclear power, similarly very popular among respondents, and abolishing the Japan-US Security Treaty is very unpopular, the JCP's position on security. In a second part of this experiment, we added party labels to this to see what would happen if we added party labels to the hypothetical manifestos. So if this was what the respondents saw in the first set of exercises, in the next set of exercises, we added party labels like LDP and Ishin here, and then asked respondents which party would they support. Now they have this cue of partisanship and other valence attributes of the LDP that they can use in their choice. Here's what the results show. So this is the change in probability of choosing a bundle when one of the party labels is attached. When any of the party labels apart from the LDP are attached to a bundle, there's a decrease in the probability of choosing that bundle among our respondents. But for the LDP only, there's an increase of about 10 percentage points in choosing that bundle just because of the attachment of the party label. So it's a strong partisanship or valence advantage that the LDP enjoys among respondents. And this shows across different policy areas, whether the policy is a LDP's policy or one of the other parties' policies, simply attaching the LDP's label makes it more likely to be chosen by respondents. So what are some of our conclusions? Voters in Japan do, to a certain extent, choose parties based on their policy preferences, but it's not entirely policy-based voting. The LDP enjoys a really strong valence advantage, so a non-policy advantage in attracting support from Japanese voters. And if this pattern continues, then the LDP dominance is likely to continue as well, even despite the fact that voters don't particularly like the LDP's policies. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you, Dan. And up next is David.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's start sharing my screen. Is that up? Is that working? Okay, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I was really thrilled to be invited into the project in the first place, actually, because I'm not a specialist on elections by any stretch of the imagination. And so when I was contacted by Professor Smith and his colleagues editing the book to write the chapter, I was just, my first thought was, wait, Japan has elections? Like, since when? Why does the same party keep winning? That was crazy. Someone should work on that. It turns out a lot of people do, not me, but a lot of other people do. And so I encourage you to read that work because it's totally enlightening. But one of the things that the editors wanted to think about was the role of the Olympics, in part because former Prime Minister Abe had put himself at the front and center of the entire bidding process, as well as appearing famously at the handover ceremony in Rio de Janeiro in 2016, dressed up as Super Mario. So he had made politics quite central to all of this. And immediately before the Olympics, Professor Smith himself co-authored with Philip Lipsey, one of the other contributors to the series, a op-ed piece for the Washington Post, basically talking about the political risks to Prime Minister Suga of going ahead with the Olympics, which were quite controversial, of course, in 2021 in the midst of a coronavirus wave. And so I think that they felt that they needed a chapter dealing with the role of the Olympics, in which case I guess they turned to me mostly because of my rippling physique and my cut body. And I mean, I wish people would recognize my intellectual contributions as well, but I think because of my reputation as a world-class athlete, they probably thought, as many do, that I'm a former Olympic medalist myself. I'm not. I was supposed to represent the country in 2000 in Sydney, but I really wanted to focus on my political science at that point. So I said, there's this 15-year-old kid, Michael Phelps, you should totally give him a chance. I think he's got a bright future. Worked out for everyone. The fact that the Olympics themselves are political is not terribly surprising. Jules Boykoff, of course, a political scientist, has been writing a lot about this, both in books like his book Power Games, but also in a ton of op-ed pieces dealing with the politics of the Olympics over the past couple of years. I dealt with it to some degree in my own book, Empire of Hope, which Professor Strauss mentioned. Because there's a lot of questions like why did Japan even need the Olympics, right? Tokyo itself is already a bustling world-class metropolis that's known around the world. It's not necessarily clear that it needed the publicity by going ahead with the Olympics, which were in fact not terribly popular right from the start. There was some sentimentality associated with the Olympics because the reputation of 1964 Olympics in Tokyo was that it helped the country emerge from the shell of World War II. It reintroduced Japan on the world stage by becoming the first Summer Olympics held in Asia. And while there are aspects of the story that are true, Japan was already going to be a major economic superpower that shortly thereafter in the century. It's not like the Olympics forced that to happen. It certainly drove a stretch of tourism in Japan, and it's remembered today as being an important coming out moment for the country, but it's not really clear that this actually dramatically affected Japan's standing on the global stage. For those of you who are interested, by the way, if there's one takeaway from my talk, it's that you should see the documentary film Tokyo Olympiad by the great director Ichikawa Kon, which is probably the greatest sports documentary ever made, and certainly one of the greatest films about sports ever made. Cannot recommend it highly enough. And that Olympics, of course, is remembered very proudly, and it's part of a sort of a central theme of Japan's reemergence from the end of World War II. Now, one of the things that sort of catapulted the support for this in Japan was the bidding process itself. The government initially tried to bid for Tokyo for 2016 and lost to Rio de Janeiro in part, in fact, mostly because public support in Japan was so low. They actually did a poll, the IOC, International Olympic Committee, did a poll of residents of Tokyo and found that something like 50% of people didn't really want the Olympics. And so that's an important aspect, that's an important criterion for judgment. So there was a massive PR bid that followed that within Japan to try to drive up support. It basically worked. And famously at the event, at the Olympic bidding event in 2013, Japan sort of called in its ringers. Prime Minister Abe was there, and they had this very popular, famous, and mixed race announcer, Takigawa Crystal, do the speech in her very fluent English, in which she memorably argued that Japan was going to welcome the world with omotenashi, or the idea of welcoming, the Japanese culture of welcoming. And when I say memorably, I'm not kidding. In fact, it was actually noted as, next slide is this was a list of the 20 most memorable moments of the Heisei era, the 30-year Heisei era. You'll actually see omotenashi is number 10. That was her saying omotenashi. That comes in above the Persian Gulf War, the first Iraq War. It comes in above a number of major natural disasters that killed thousands of people. Omotenashi was number 10 among Japanese citizens remembering the Heisei era. So this moment was big because of this moment that we're going to welcome the world. She herself, of course, is central to politics. Takigawa is, the wife, shortly thereafter married Koizumi Shinjiro, at that point, the environment minister for Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Suga, very handsome political figure, Koizumi Shinjiro, and also the son of the very handsome former prime minister, Koizumi. And by the way, someone ought to do a book on dynasties and democracy. That's my feeling. Also written by the very handsome political scientist, Daniel Smith. So this topic is sort of central to politics. Like, politics has been at the core of this for a while, right? But Tokyo 2020, the support was moderately high. It went up between 2013 and 2020 to the point that, you know, in 2019, before COVID hit, about 75–80% of Japanese and Tokyo residents thought that having the Olympics was a good idea. 20% were sort of grumbling and fetching about the idea of having, you know, crowds of people coming in, the streets being, you know, crowded, the cost overruns and so forth. There was criticism that emerged, but it was all on the predictable level of the Olympics. There was corruption in the bidding process, but that always happens. There were cost overruns in the production of facilities. That always happens. So all of this was pretty standard fare for the Olympics. Of course, what turned this was, of course, the coronavirus pandemic, when the idea of suddenly welcoming in tens of thousands of athletes, staff, spectators, and so forth into Japan, actually hundreds of thousands in the middle of a pandemic, made the entire thing seem like a risk not worth going ahead with. As everyone knows, the Olympics were delayed for a year, and this was a costly and risky process for everyone involved. Prime Minister Suga, who took over for Prime Minister Abe upon his resignation, of course, made the decision to go ahead with it, but there was a bit of a gun to his head pointed by Thomas Bach, the head of the International Olympic Committee, because the IOC contract with host cities dictates that if the host city cancels the games, basically all of the cost for canceled TV contracts, canceled everything, falls to the city, falls to the host. So Tokyo would have been left with an even bigger financial black hole than it was had it canceled the games. Bach himself, by the way, is even less popular than Prime Minister Suga was at his nadir. Bach is actually less popular in Japan than probably Kim Jong-un. So Thomas Bach is not well loved within Japan at the moment. Now, as everyone knows, the delays themselves had all sorts of financial consequences for Japan, right? First of all, there were contracts in terms of the facilities, when they were going to be built, what their subsequent uses would be, that all had to be renegotiated, canceled. The absence of spectators, as well as the collapse of any sort of secondary benefits for other cities in Japan of international tourism, all of those things disappeared. One thing, as someone who's interested in just in political symbolism, interested me was just what story was going to be told. Because originally, clearly, when Abe chose to host the Olympics and sort of put forward a bid, I think he wanted to sort of present Japan on the global stage. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that he wanted to present Japan on the global stage as a very sort of proud, strong nation that was still a leader in Asia, the way that, for example, China had been able to do in 2008, when it memorably had the most remarkable opening ceremonies probably any of us had ever seen, directed by the legendary Chinese film director Zhang Yimou. By the way, he also just did the Beijing Winter Olympics opening ceremony as well. After that, recognizing they couldn't top China in sheer scale, Britain chose Danny Boyle, Academy Award-winning director, to come up with a very sort of cheeky, funny, sort of progressively nationalistic approach to introducing London on the global stage. Abe, I think, partly for this reason, chose on the left his own favorite film director, Yamazaki Takashi, to be part of the opening ceremony committee, really as the creative director of the games. And Yamazaki is known for a number of pretty nationalistic films, not necessarily right-wing fire-breathing films, but often softly nostalgic films about Japan's re-emerging on the global stage. He's made his money largely through popular anime, things like Stand By Me, but made a movie in which the Yamato, the mighty battleship, was restored from the bottom of the ocean to save Earth from aliens. He's, of course, famous for Eie no Zero, about kamikaze pilots, which a film that won the Japan Academy Awards, but was criticized by a number of people for sort of soft pedaling Japanese militarism. And he was chosen to sort of tell the story about what Japan's post-war was going to be. The reemergence of the emergence of the COVID pandemic made this sort of not viable. You couldn't have an opening ceremony that was all about how awesome Japan is, how Japan reconstructed itself in the midst of this pandemic. So I think they wisely changed courses and decided to refocus on sort of a more welcoming idea that was going to talk about the pandemic and the consequences for the globe. But that was beset by catastrophes, right? The person who took over, advertising executive Sasaki Hiroshi, was forced to resign after making a grotesque joke about the weight of comedian Watanabe Naomi. This was then released in the press. Watanabe Naomi is so likable that she's actually more likable than Paul Rudd that she's photographed with here. And that's like impossible, but she's awesome. And so he makes fun of her for being overweight and is forced to resign. But the opening ceremony committee then is taken over by people like Kobayashi Kentaro and musician Oyamata Shinji, who in the days immediately before the opening ceremony are revealed to have either given grotesquely obscene interviews, as Oyamata did, about his treatment of developmentally disabled classmates when he was in school, or Kobayashi's skit as a member of a comedy duo in which they made a joke about the Holocaust. So the effort to sort of remake the Olympics as a moment to welcome the entire world was getting off to a very, very, very bad start. Like the press in the immediate run up to the games was utterly catastrophic, to the point that people in Japan were saying the Olympics themselves are cursed. Things turned around relatively quickly. The opening ceremonies went off smoothly. They came across as modest, as an effort to be gentle and welcoming to the world. Japan actually had a record medal haul with a bunch of very likable athletes like the Abe siblings, who both won golds in judo. And the Olympics themselves were a success. So the question was, would this actually benefit Prime Minister Suga? Prime Minister Suga himself had, of course, taken immense risks given the unpopularity of the games and the run up to them, as well as the risks of the COVID pandemic. There were no public health catastrophes associated with the Olympics. The bad press in the Olympics petered out after a couple of days, and for the most part, the media coverage was about how well Japanese athletes did. Here's Suga trying to capitalize on this by actually making phone calls, which were awkwardly videotaped and shown on television with a number of gold medal winners. And this to me points to one of just the interesting risks about the Olympics. We know that they're political, and yet they're supposed to be not political, right? And that gap there is actually something that makes them really hard to exploit, right? Suga couldn't actually make this an active part of a political campaign to save his own job as his popularity was falling, even though he had largely been responsible for keeping the Olympics going. He wanted to take a victory lap, but these 12 weeks that take place, even just the 4 weeks between the end of the Olympics and his own being forced from office, were long enough that there was very little sort of super public enthusiasm about his tenure in the first place. And he certainly couldn't make this about him. Interestingly, by the way, when he was forced out of office, it was declining support from members of the party that basically made him resign. Most famously, Mr. Omotenashi, Koizumi's son, was basically the one who did the coup de grace, who went in and had told Suga, you know, I can't support you anymore. You have to resign. And that was really the final blow. And this is Koizumi himself crying on camera immediately after telling Suga, I can't support you anymore, coming across very much like Wesley Snipes in New Jack City as he's about to shoot his friend. And this is in fact Koizumi taking the Suga taking the fatal blow. So after having been shot by Mr. Omotenashi, which leaves, of course, Kishida in charge. And once Kishida is in charge, there's very little discussion of the Olympics at all in the election. Very little. In the run-up in the election, there's very little crowing about it by the LDP. Kishida himself had not been a stalwart backer of the Olympics in the first place. He wasn't like associated with it very deeply. No one else in the party was talking about it much, partly because taking credit for it would have seemed just bizarre, since it was the athletes who had been doing most of the work. Was the timing off? If they had the election, or if they'd had the election immediately after the Olympics, could Suga have held on? Possibly, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And certainly timing it right after the Olympics would have made the crass nature, this sort of quid pro quo, I gave you the Olympics, now vote for me, nature of the political aspect of the Olympics a little too obvious for almost any political figure to survive. By the way, when I was looking for pictures of Kishida, this came up, and it's actually just a question of whether or not Kishida is affected by John Maynard Keynes. But I really like it as a photo because it looked like Kishida just got digitized into It's a Wonderful Life. So, so I'm keeping that. In writing the chapter, one thing I was thinking about was Sion Nagai, a political theorist a literary theorist at University of Chicago, who wrote a terrific book a couple of years back called Theory of the Gimmick, in which he talks about the role of the gimmick in basically capitalist economics. Like many literary scholars, is interested in this sort of connection of capitalism and literature. But her main question in this case was whether or not a gimmick was something that simultaneously seemed to save labor by doing something clever, while also seeming to devalue it by seeming gimmicky and unnatural and not really hard work. And it struck me that this is one of the problems of using the Olympics politically. We know that they're political. Everyone in public knows that they're political. And yet calling attention to them would have called attention to the nature of the gimmick, would have actually made the decision to hold the game seem gimmicky in the first place, less an act of patriotism, less an act of promoting Japan, and more an act of keeping myself or my party in power. So it was just something I was playing with as I was writing the chapter. I wanted to leave this to you because that would be my second takeaway from this would be, if you're not reading Sion Nagai's work, it's well worth reading. She's a very fine theorist. Anyway, I will wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for including me in this book. And Japan does have elections. Very exciting to know.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Leheny. And our final presenter is Dr. Lee, Yeon Ju Lee. Dave,
Sorry.
would you stop?
Yeah, I stopped. Yeah, I did.
Okay.
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
You're muted, Yeon Ju.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. Okay, thank you for inviting me to this wonderful roundtable. So I wrote a book chapter in this edited book on inequality and the 2021 election. And so the theme was, does income inequality matter in Japan, especially when Japan is known as one of the more egalitarian countries in the world? So, in the recent years, the past decade, income inequality has been a very important political agenda in many democracies around the world. But it doesn't always follow the pattern where, countries with high levels of income inequality have this very active income inequality as political agenda in elections. So for instance, this shows the post-tax transfer Gini, so income inequality measured by post-tax transfer Gini in the select number of countries. And India, which is one of the most inegalitarian countries in the world with very high level of income inequality. So we would expect that, voters should care about income inequality, and income inequality should be a primary issue in electoral scene. However, income inequality was never a primary issue in elections in India, although in 2019 general election, there was some discussion about addressing income inequality among politicians. However, it was never really a primary issue that had a huge impact on electoral outcomes. On the other hand, there is a country like South Korea, which has relatively low level of income inequality. And just like Japan, Korea is known for, sort of very low level of income inequality, but with, relatively high economic growth when it was going through economic development. But in South Korea, more than 97% of voters, on average, believe that income inequality is a really, really serious issue and should be addressed through, elections and also, policies and so on. So income inequality, right now, there is a campaign, very heated campaign for presidential election in South Korea going on right now. And income inequality is one of the key issues for these candidates. So what about Japan? which also has a low level of income inequality like South Korea. So do we see income inequality as a politically salient issue? So does income inequality matter in Japanese politics? So this is sort of the question that I wanted to address in this book chapter. And the presentation will follow this outline. So I'll briefly go over how income inequality has evolved over time in Japan. And I'll talk about whether income inequality mattered or not for the 2021 election in Japan. And I'll talk about this new capitalism that Prime Minister Kishida has come up with, which is sort of the key agenda for his, for the coming years. And then I'll conclude. So this shows how income inequality has evolved in 3 advanced democracies, Japan, the United Kingdom, and United States. So I wanted to compare Japan to these more advanced economies because they are sort of the top economies in the world in terms of GDP. And you can see that, so when you look at the income inequality before taxes and transfer or after taxes and transfer, you can see Japan, depicted in the red line. So the level of income inequality has always been sort of relatively low in Japan compared to these other comparable advanced economies. Although for the post-tax transfer Gini, the income inequality after taxes and transfer. So, since 2010, so the income inequality in Japan sort of became higher than that of United Kingdom after all the redistribution. However, overall, you can see that income inequality in Japan has been relatively low compared to other advanced economies. So it's not just United Kingdom and the United States, but compared to other democracy and advanced economies, Japan's income inequality has been relatively low. So we could think that maybe income inequality never really was a key issue in Japanese politics because it has never been that high compared to other countries. However, if we focus just on looking at how income inequality has evolved over time in Japan, just focusing on Japan, it did go through some changes. So you can see in 1970s, it was pretty low. And then in 1980s, over 1990s, it started to increase dramatically. And then there was some sort of pause or stagnation in mid 2000s and then started to increase again. So it did go through some changes over time. However, overall, it's been sort of increasing trend. And this plot show, so that the plot on the left shows the GDP, so how the Japanese economy has been doing, and that's sort of depicted by the dotted line, and the solid line is the income inequality measured with post-tax transfer Gini, and the plot on the right side shows the relative redistribution, so how much redistribution took place. And you can see that in 1970s, the GDP was, it was increasing, but it was, very mild increase. And also we see, low income inequality. And then when in 1980s and 1990s, early 1990s. So when the Japanese economy really boomed, so when the GDP sort of skyrocketed, you can see that income inequality increased with the GDP. So you can see the GDP and, income inequality sort of went in tandem. So they sort of follow the similar trend. And at the same time, when there was a lot of economic growth, but also increasing income inequality, you can see that on the right side, so the amount of redistribution decreased. And then the bubble popped. So the end of bubble economy in early 1990s. And then the Japanese economy went into this long stagnation. Some say last 2 decades, something last decade. So during this period, you can see that GDP growth sort of went up and down, but it was overall stagnant, and income inequality also sort of fell. in the mid 2005. And you see that in terms of redistribution, not much redistribution happening in the first last decade, probably because of the economic and financial constraint. And then, however, in 2000s, the amount of redistribution increased a lot. And then here comes 2000, early 2010 till current. And this here, you see this divergence between income inequality and GDP. So, until then, they were pretty highly correlated. So sort of they were in tandem. But since early 2010, you see this divergence of economic growth or the GDP and income inequality. And income inequality continue to increase while the economy sort of did very poorly. And this overlaps with the former Prime Minister's Abenomics, which focused on growth and efficiency. So Abe really tried to revitalize the Japanese economy, but it didn't really work out as expected. Although it did, you can see the little bump in around 2015. So there was some increase in GDP. However, the economy couldn't overcome this stagnation, but income inequality continued to grow while the economy was doing poorly. And also the redistribution, a lot of redistribution happening through taxes and transfer fell dramatically during this period of Abenomics. So then how income inequality mattered or not matter in previous election. So even if you see this increasing income inequality and sort of poor economic performance since early 2010, income inequality has not been a primary issue in the past election, although it has been increasing all the time. And inequality was more seen as an issue of regional vitalization. So the focus was on economic and social gap between urban and rural areas rather than income differences between the rich and poor. So income inequality, the topic or the word income inequality wasn't even in political campaigns or news polls or newspapers. It was usually regional vitalization or regional inequality that sort of focused on this gap between urban and rural areas in terms of development. And this graph also shows that Japanese people were not very perceptive of income inequality or how it has been increasing over time. So the yellow bar presented 2009 and green bar showed the 2019 data. And to this question, whether people agree or disagree with the statement income differences are too large. So you can see that the actual income inequality increased a lot compared to 2019, if you compare 2009 and 2019. However, you can see that actually more people strongly disagree with the statement that income differences are too large, and actually less people strongly agree with the statement that income differences are too large. So even though the actual income inequality increased significantly in this between 2009 and 2019, people somewhat became less perceptive of income inequality. So you can see that income inequality was never really a salient issue to voters in the past election. And here comes the 2021 election. So voters actually started to become aware of income inequality as an important issue during the 2021 election season, which is different from the previous elections in 2017 and 2014. So this pie chart shows it was conducted pre-election. So asked Japanese eligible voters which issue they thought the incoming lower house members should prioritize. And you can see this blue part that I sort of highlighted with the red triangle is the income disparity or income inequality. So economic policy had the most votes, followed by COVID-19, and then diplomacy and security and pensions and welfare. So income disparity became the fifth most important issue. So you might think, oh, then it's not really important issue at all, because you could see that people care about economic policy and COVID-19 and welfare much more than income inequality. But this is very significant if we compare this to past elections, because in 2014 or 17, in the past elections, income inequality or income disparity was not even among the options that people could choose from. So, none of the surveys or polls even had income inequality as an option to choose from, and it received no attention from voters. And also, when I conducted interviews and also open-ended survey questions in my original survey conducted on a representative sample of Japanese eligible voters, what was interesting was a lot of people actually saw income inequality as an issue of economic policy. So a lot of votes, when people chose economic policy, it's not just about economic growth or corporate structuring or things like that. A lot of people had income inequality in their mind when they chose economic policy. So some people actually found it a little bit confusing because they saw it as an economic issue, but seeing income disparity as an option to choose from. So a lot of people were sort of confused between that when these kind of surveys were conducted. So these open-ended answers to open-ended questions sort of revealed that a lot of votes who people cared about income inequality could have got into this economic policy. So it is pretty significant. But when they were asked with simpler questions, so when they were asked to choose which of the two, economic growth or economic inequality, they thought were more important for the lower house members to address, you could see that it received about the similar number of votes, right? So 43% of respondents chose economic growth and 41% of the respondents chose economic inequality. So there wasn't much difference between the two options. So you can see that voters actually really started to care about addressing income inequality. And income inequality has risen as an important issue for voters in Japan for the 2021 election. So that was sort of voters' perspective, and parties' election manifestos reflected increased public attention to income inequality. So the opposition parties, so here I mean the CDP and the Socialist and the Communist Party and Reiwa, so they sort of really really focus on redistribution, tackling income disparity through redistribution. And they said they want to achieve this all middle class society through redistribution and fairer tax systems. And some of the policies they talked about to achieve this was increase taxes on the rich and set higher corporate tax rates on large businesses and exempt income tax for those who earn 10 million yen or less, and also temporarily lower the consumption tax to 5%. So they want to restructure the tax system. And so there is a higher burden on the rich and the large companies and less burden on the middle class and the poor. And they also wanted to expand welfare provision to actually help the poor people. And the Liberal Democratic Party had similar policies to address income inequality. And here the Prime Minister Kishida came up with this term new capitalism to promote this virtuous cycle of growth and distribution rather than choosing between growth or distribution. And they also said they want to increase the real incomes of the people through decreasing tax burden on companies, which raise wages, and also expand welfare provision. So here, they are somewhat similar that they want to address income inequality, and Kishida did emphasize redistribution as opposition parties did. However, for the party manifesto, for the election manifesto, the LDP didn't really talk about the restructuring tax system as the opposition party talked about. So it was more of promoting growth to address income inequality and doing this balance between growth and redistribution. But the opposition party really focused on making a fairer tax system by increasing tax burden on the rich and decreasing the tax burden on the poor. But that was not that evident in the policy platform of the LDP for this election. Now, why did income inequality matter in 2021 in contrast to other elections? So the first thing would be the negative consequences of Abenomics, which would be sort of the necessary conditions. So there was, the economy wasn't doing very well, and income inequality was increasing, and there wasn't much redistribution happening. So there were all these negative consequences of Abenomics, but these all existed for the past elections as well. So there was nothing different in terms of negative consequences of Abenomics in 2021. But what really made the difference was the COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic, because people were really impacted by this pandemic economically and financially. So their financial burden increased a lot, and a lot of small business went bankrupt, and people really had this disastrous impact on everyday life in terms of their finances. And so this sort of COVID-19 sort of served as a trigger, or served as sufficient condition for people to become aware of all these negative consequences of Abenomics, including the increasing income inequality. So people became very aware of this increasing gap between the rich and poor, and how the middle class is faltering, and so on. And I want to talk briefly about the new capitalism. So the Kishida really promoted this idea of new capitalism to address income inequality, but also to revitalize Japanese economy. And it's a virtuous cycle of growth and distribution, rather than choosing between growth or distribution to boost the economy. And new capitalism will create rules to correct harmful effects of capitalism, to maximize the benefits of capitalism. So it's different from this kind of socialism or this socialist welfare regimes that European countries once implemented, but it's promoting capitalism, but balancing between growth and distribution, rather than just focusing on redistribution. And in January, in his speech to the Diet, so he's gonna release more concrete action plans in spring. So we will see. But in his speech, so he talked about this growth strategy and distribution strategy. So his new capitalism will consist of these two types of strategies. And the growth strategy contains his policies of digitalization to boost economic growth and economic security, and investing in science, technology, and innovation. So he will focus on these areas to boost economic growth. And at the same time, he will also pursue distribution strategy, which consists of increasing wages and also increasing minimum wages, wage incomes, and investing in people, and focusing on the middle class of the next generation, and also trying to address the gender income gap, and promoting the public sector and private sector cooperation. So this is sort of his vision of new capitalism, to balance economic growth and distribution, to address income inequality, but also to promote economic growth. So that if income inequality gained political salience in the 2021 election, why did it not necessarily affect vote choice? And it's probably because the difference between the ruling party and the opposition party's relevant policies was too marginal. So the difference was not that large between the two parties, because they all emphasize addressing income disparity through redistribution. So although the specific policies sort of differ, but the catchphrase or the slogans were pretty much the same. So I think there wasn't that huge difference for voters to tell. And that probably had some sort of impact on income inequality not having a decisive impact on the 2021 election. And I think income inequality will remain as a salient issue unless people's economic well-being significantly improve through a substantial increase in wages and household incomes redistribution. And whether and how the Kishida administration can realize this new form of capitalism, and whether the opposition's party can dominate this agenda, I think will have very important implications for the future elections and Japanese politics in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. All right, well, those were three really interesting presentations. So I would like now to take maybe about 15 minutes to do some question and answer. So what I'm thinking is I can collect questions. So I assume some people in the audience have some questions, and then we can go to each of the presenters and let them answer the ones that they're, you know, that they're able to. So I have some questions. I mean, I feel like you've heard from me and the three presenters. So please, audience members, if anyone has any questions, otherwise I'm happy to use the chair's prerogative and jump in. Okay, well, I have questions for each of you. So first for Professor Smith. So your argument that the sort of the party label of the LDP is sort of so strong, or basically it trumps policy positions, was a really interesting one. But I was just thinking about like the mechanics of the survey experiment. So if I'm a voter and I'm seeing, do you like the LDP? And then you list a bunch of policies that the LDP doesn't actually support. If I say, oh yeah, I like the LDP, I mean, it seems like if I would say, oh yeah, I like the LDP anyway, and sort of not notice that those aren't policies that the LDP actually supported, it would suggest that I'm not a very knowledgeable voter. So did you have like a voter knowledge check, or was the sort of the party label effect bigger for voters that didn't know much about politics and just sort of appreciated the party labels as shortcuts? And then for Professor Leheny, my question is, I really liked what you were saying about the sort of the challenge of using of actually using the Olympics as a political symbol. And I was thinking about it with the Olympics going on in China right now. And I was thinking if you think that might be more of a challenge for leaders in democracies. So there's something like where China can sort of, they don't have to worry about going to the ballot box and seeming sincere, sort of, you know, winning support over some opposition party. They can just sort of more straightforwardly say, yes, the Olympics are a demonstration of Chinese greatness, and not have to worry about sort of seeming weird at the ballot box relative to their competitors. And then finally, for Professor Lee, how do you, I mean, thinking about, I thought that was really interesting that the sort of the emergence of inequality is an issue in 2021, and especially in light of the fact that I think that it totally makes sense that a lot of the people that were saying they care about economic issues really define economic issues to mean inequality. But I wonder then, how do you explain this, according to the data that Professor Smith showed us, the only party that really did well in the election was Ishin. So did Ishin have any particular message about inequality that resonated with voters, or can we explain their success in light of their inequality stance? So those are my questions for all three presenters. But before the presenters go, does anyone in the audience have questions they want to add?
I guess like I would just add to your question on Ishin, because I was just going to ask about that too, and particularly like why I guess like right-wing populism or like the Ishin platform did well in Osaka. You mentioned that, Professor Smith, I believe, in your presentation. I was curious to learn more about that.
Okay, any other questions? Or all right, we'll go ahead, presenters.
Sure, I'll go first with your questions. So I'll say briefly on Ishin. The interesting thing about Ishin is it's a regional party, started in Osaka, and so it has a really strong regional base. And it's tried to expand beyond Osaka in the past, but it tends to still do mostly well in that part of the country. So you can think of it as similar to other parties with regional strength in other countries like the Lega Nord in Italy, for example. But to answer the main question, we do a bunch of other things in this survey experiment, which is sort of a side project from the Japan Decides volume. But we're trying to figure out why the LDP keeps winning. And there are lots of explanations in the literature, including in Japan, literature on why Japan has single party dominance. So there's the coalition with the Komeito, which is a big factor. There is the LDP's strong organized vote with, or sometimes this is characterized as clientelism, but where it has support among organized interests through promising different policies that benefit them, and it can do that because it has control of the government for so long. What we wanted to focus on was, is there a policy basis to their support? Do voters actually like the LDP based on its policies? And one of the tests that we include is this party label effect. And what it tells us is that, one way to interpret it is that respondents are just satisfying and using the party label as a heuristic. But then we can compare what its effect on different types of respondents. And naturally, respondents who already support the LDP are much more likely to use that heuristic and continue to support the LDP. But even without the party label, even without queuing that, we also ask our respondents, not just in this election, but in the 2017 election as well, which party they intend to vote for. And we see a huge bump, or we call it a valence advantage, but a higher probability of supporting the LDP, regardless of the policy positions that it produces, even without queuing party label. And the takeaway that we're arguing, and actually one of the collaborators, Shusei Eshima, will be presenting it at JPOS this week, is that there is policy voting in Japan. It's just that the LDP has this boost. We call it a valence boost, but you could think of valence being credibility. You could think of it as being partisanship. Essentially, voters think that the LDP's ability to govern or attractiveness as a party is better than the rest of the parties. And it doesn't really matter whether Ishin or the CDP or other parties are proposing policies that are more popular. They can't compete with the LDP on policy alone. They have to try to improve their brand with voters. That's sort of our main takeaway.
All right, thank you, Dan. And I just pasted in, so JPOS is the speaker series that Dan is involved with organizing, run, I think, out of Harvard. It's an online speaker series. It's very good. I feel like it's very regularly on Thursday evenings. There's great presentations about Japanese politics. So I just pasted the link if you want to go hear any of those presentations. Dave, do you want to go next?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, in response to your question, I don't think there's any reason why even a leader in a democracy can't try to score like diplomatic points through the Olympics, right? I mean, certainly Suga put himself out there as much as possible in the run up to the Olympics, and getting the support of people like Biden and so forth was something that he and others trumpeted in the press. And I think so. I think the national leaders will do this on the diplomatic stage. It's more for domestic politics that it's really just hard to find any sort of systematic evidence that anyone really gets a real bump from being prime minister or president or whatever when the Olympics happen. I mean, just given the number of countries, the timing of elections and so forth would make any sort of systematic study of this, I think, quite difficult. But even the ones that I was able to consult, which weren't a lot of them, kind of rejected the idea that there was any sort of systematic benefits to political leaders. Instead, what you can find is a sort of a systematic use of Olympic language by politicians in Olympic seasons, but that's both opposition parties and incumbent parties. So it's not like there was any sort of way to test who actually benefited from this. With regard to Japan, you know, the curse of the Olympics is something that was brought up as Suga was sort of about to fall by I think the Yomiuri and a couple of others, that Japanese prime ministers have never fared well in the aftermath of the Olympics. I mean, you know, Ikeda was very sick and resigned right after the Olympics in '64 because of cancer. But so we can't attribute that to the Olympics or anything like that. But Obviously, in 1972, the success of the Sapporo Winter Olympics didn't save Prime Minister Sato. The 1990, when were the Nagano Olympics? I'm trying to remember who stepped down right after that. But whichever prime minister was in, had to step down more or less right after that. And so Suga stepping down continues a pattern that I don't think is causal in any meaningful way, but it certainly makes it hard to suggest that there's anything truly shocking about the fact that he didn't benefit a tremendous amount from this. Now, with regard to, President Xi in China, of course he's going to use this, but how would we even know whether or not this was politically helpful to him at home, right? I mean, given the absence of elections as well as the difficulty of trusting public opinion polls, in China, it's just not clear how Chinese themselves sort of react to what I assume are omnipresent pro-Olympic messaging. I imagine China being a complicated place and Chinese people being complicated like people are everywhere. I imagine there are people who are turned off by this or kind of cynical about it. But how you would actually read that in polls, I think it'd be hard to know. So I think it's not to me surprising that the Olympics didn't end up having the kind of effects that we might see. Where I think the reason why the editors of the book contacted me to write this initially was really what Professor Smith brought out in the essay that he wrote with Philip Lipsey, which was that this could have actually been really important, right? I mean, there was no reason why it couldn't have turned out to be disastrous had you actually had a wave that was attributable to a number of athletes coming in. If there had been stories about athletes getting sick and then taking up hospital beds in the middle of an overcrowding wave, and finding out some story of Japanese citizens themselves being unable to get to hospitals in time while they're dying of COVID because the rooms had been set aside for athletes, that was entirely plausible. That was stuff that was actually being discussed in the press. That would have been utterly disastrous for the LDP. And I'm not certain that Suga's resignation would have saved them at that point. So I think it's entirely reasonable to assume that it could have mattered. I just think that the fact that it went relatively smoothly ultimately meant that it didn't.
We also invited you because we knew you'd write a really gripping and entertaining chapter for the volume.
I apologize for spelling Japan wrong the entire draft. That was really embarrassing. There's only one J. Who knew?
So compared to the previous elections, income inequality it did gain this political salience in 2021 election. However, I don't think it was sort of the key issue that that had this decisive impact on the election outcome, as I sort of briefly mentioned in the conclusion. And one thing would be that addressing COVID-19 and economic growth were sort of the most important issues to voters, although many voters sort of confused between income inequality and economic growth, and some saw that as sort of similar issues. And another possible answer would be that I think even if people think income inequality is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, a lot of people actually think economic growth is the answer to address income inequality. So, when you ask voters in survey questions, so which option do you think best, resolves income inequality, and it's torn, so maybe like economists and some people might think, oh, it's a redistribution, like more progressive taxation. However, many, people think economic growth is actually key to addressing income inequality. And some people also see redistribution or, making more progressive tax system as a solution to income inequality. So I think, people kind of, even if the income inequality was a key issue for many voters, I think they could have emphasized economic growth more over redistribution or, parties with more progressive, tax policies, because they thought economic growth could be a solution to addressing income inequality. And with regard to your question about the Ishin party, so Ishin didn't really have an explicit statement of addressing income disparity through redistribution. However, they did talk about policies to increase the disposable household incomes through reducing consumption tax to 5% level for 2 years. So they came up with these policies to increase sort of the real disposable household income, which would sort of which could be seen as indirect sort of measure of addressing income inequality. However, unlike these other oppositions party, they didn't explicitly sort of mention addressing income disparities through distribution or redistribution.
All right, well, thank you to our three presenters very much for a really interesting talk, and thank you to the audience for joining us. And we have another, the same way that you find out about this, watch that channel, because we will have another talk at the end of the month by Kristen Vakazi about supply chain issues in Japan, China, between Japan, China, and the United States. So please join me in thanking our presenters, and hopefully I will catch you at